meetup of the Sri Lanka Power BI community. We hope all of you are keeping well and safe. So today we have two speakers, one featured speaker, Matthias Thierbach, hope I got that correct, and Afifa Zuhair, who's from our own community, who will be doing a session afterwards. So for Matthias's session, he'll be speaking of Power BI dataset CI/CD with Power BI tools. So Matthias spent over 10 years as a software developer before moving to Power BI, and then afterwards realized that development and engineering tools weren't as developed in Power BI as the software world. So with that, he started the Power BI tools project, and which is the only complete source control solution for Power BI. And so with that, in addition to that, he is the head of finance systems at YouGov and spends quite a bit of time teaching and spreading the word about Power BI tools to the community. So Matthias, we are happy to have you here, and thank you for taking time off your schedule to speak to us. The screen is all yours.
Brilliant. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for inviting me. It's a great pleasure. Let me share my screen and move to my slides and then take it from there. That is hopefully the right screen. If you could just give me a quick... Yep. Yeah, okay. Awesome. Brilliant. All right. So I'm going to talk about PBI tools in the context of CI/CD and automated deployments for data sets. So let me just introduce myself very briefly, although you've already done a pretty good job. So I've been in the Microsoft BI space since about 2015, started working with Power BI almost from the very beginning, and been working on pbi-tools, which is an open source and freely available external tool for Power BI for about 6 years now. The tool was developed sort of privately for quite a while, and I made it open source and publicly available last year in October 21. And my day job, as you mentioned, is actually head of finance systems at YouGov, which has a very strong focus on Power BI and analytics. So everything that's in PBI tools was basically triggered by requirements and needs I've had as part of doing my day job. So what do we want to cover today? Agenda. I've got quite a few items here, so I'll have to do a really good job in getting it all covered. So let me start off with setting some goals so that everyone understands what we're trying to do here and what's out of scope. I'm very briefly going to introduce PBI tools for anyone who hasn't heard or seen it. I'm going to talk about the deployment and CI/CD setup, and then it's mostly demos. My goal is that everyone can walk away with an understanding of, first of all, what could be a possible CI/CD setup for Power BI datasets. Secondly, how can PBI tools help with doing that? And thirdly, how do you get started? Where do you actually find some examples and the right docs? Right. So what are the goals here in terms of what we're trying to achieve with dataset CI/CD? So first of all, a Git repository, a source code repository should serve as the single source of truth for Power BI datasets, as opposed to multiple PBIX files, possibly with different versions flying around on people's laptops or on some shared drives where you don't quite know, well, which one is actually the latest version and what changes happened between this one and another version. Secondly, we want to be able to distinguish multiple environments for development, for UAT, for production in this particular case, so that there's a proper workflow in place for changes to get into production. We want to be able to review them and test them in a separate and dedicated environment. Thirdly, deployments into those environments should come from the central code repository, as opposed to some individuals clicking a button or going into Power BI Desktop and clicking publish. The logic as part of the deployment or the logic driving the deployment actually should be part of source control as well. And finally, and that's something which is really important to me as part of running a data management team, we want to be able to actually work collaboratively on Power BI data sets rather than one person being the only one able to do any changes here. So, as I said very briefly, what is pbi-tools? pbi.tools is the website where you can read more about it. And the core idea was to enable proper source control for Power BI projects, be that Power BI reports or Power BI data sets. I will most likely add support for data flows as well in the future, but for now it's reports and data sets. Basically be able to implement all those goals I spelled out before, where you end up having your source control system as the central repository, which is your single source of truth. pbi-tools offers 3 main features: extract, compile, deploy. I'm going to talk about those in a bit more on the next slide. Just wanted to point out the link, go-to.pbi.tools/YouTube. That's a public YouTube playlist, which I think currently has about 20 recordings. This is where I'm collecting all previous presentations I've done around pbi-tools, and so that's definitely a useful place to go and see different aspects of the tool. Right. So just coming back to what I said previously in terms of the main features. So first of all, on the left-hand side, as we develop a Power BI report or a Power BI data set, we use tools like Power BI Desktop, Tabular Editor, DAX Studio, and various other external tools. But what we generally end up with is a PBIX file or a BIM file in the case of data sets. And what pbi-tools allows is to extract that file into a source control compatible format. So this is where extract comes in, which would be the first main feature. I'm going to show that in a demo in terms of what it looks like. So once we then extract, we get into the center pillar here, where we're basically in the world of source control, and where we can look at our project using tools like VS Code, where we use Git, and where we use the various Git hosting systems like Azure DevOps, GitHub, GitLab, and Bitbucket, and whatever they're called. So here we basically have a folder structure as opposed to just a single file. And we'll see that in a second. Now, obviously, in order to then be able to go back into our original tools, we need to be able to create a PBX file from that folder structure, and this is what pbi-tools calls compile. So this is basically the reverse of extract, which allows us to go from a PBX file into a folder structure and then back into a PBX file. And so those two features combined allow full source control. If we then put on top of that the ability to actually deploy those artifacts straight into Power BI, which is what we're looking at today, then we've got the full story in place. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to move on. So the setup for today, first of all, dataset deployments using pbi-tools is a relatively new feature. In fact, it's so new, it's currently available as a preview. However, I've done a pretty comprehensive write-up on the pbi-tools website. The link up here is the one that gets you there. It explains pretty much everything I'm going to be showing in the next half hour or so in great detail. So definitely use that as a reference point. Secondly, there is a public GitHub repository in the pbi-tools organization available, which has the full sources for the demo project we're using today. So basically, we've got a Contoso Power BI dataset, which sits in GitHub, but it could obviously be any other Git hosting system as well. And in Power BI, I set up 3 different environments: development, UAT, production. Those 3 environments are linked to 2 different workspaces, which is just an arbitrary choice. There could easily be 1 workspace or 3 workspaces. But for this demo today, we've got one workspace called datasets dev. We've got another workspace called datasets prod. And the datasets prod workspace happens to contain the UAT version of the dataset as well as the production version. Again, this is an arbitrary choice, and I just wanted to use that to demonstrate that there's quite a lot of flexibility here. So at the end of the day, we've got 3 different versions of the dataset in our Power BI tenant, each of which corresponding to a different environment, and we're distinguishing dev, UAT, production. As far as the Git repository is concerned, there are 3 main components in here. I'll show those in a second. First of all, we've got the dataset sources. Secondly, we've got YAML files defining GitHub workflows. So that's pretty much our CI/CD pipeline. And thirdly, we've got a pbi-tools manifest, which is a simple JSON file which defines what we're deploying and where. And so those 3 together, dataset sources, YAML plus deployment manifest, is all we need. Lastly, we're using a branching model in order to determine how changes in the repository actually trigger deployments into particular environments. The main branch, by convention, always represents production, and I'm using a release branching model where basically upcoming releases, as they're being worked on, are being integrated into a release branch, and work items which are being worked on as part of a release sit in issue branches. Now, that's a lot of theory. Let's look at this in let's look at this in both Power BI as well as GitHub. So I mentioned 2 workspaces. This is one. Oops, sorry. This is one of them. It's the datasets dev workspace, and we can see there's the Contoso sales dev dataset in here. Then secondly, we've got the datasets prod workspace, and that one happens to have Contoso sales, which is production, and Contoso sales UAT. So we've got that, and we also have, let me just get to the correct window here. Sorry, here we go. We also have this public GitHub repository. Again, that's accessible to anyone. It contains the 3 different artifacts I just talked about. And it also has some actions defined. In fact, it actually has workflows for each individual environment, dev, UAT, and prod. And also, GitHub natively has a concept of environments, which very conveniently is actually showing up right on the front page of my repository. And I can see which environments have I deployed into recently and what's the current status there. So it says active for production UAT, as we can see. Dev doesn't show up here right now because the last time I deployed into the dev environment was over a week ago, and GitHub then basically archives those sources. So why don't we look at that just so we see something happening? Here we go. So if I go to the dev workflow, I have the option to actually trigger a deployment manually. This is not what you would normally do. Normally this would all happen automatically, but just for demo purposes, so we can see something happen, I'm going to go in here and say, please run this workflow. Oops, sorry, I'm not really so good with my screenshots today, with my shortcuts. Here we go. So please run this workflow, run it off the issue/warn branch, and don't do it in what if mode. Don't worry what that means for now. So if I click that, it's basically going to trigger a workflow straight away. We can see this one has a orange or brownish icon there. If I click on it, we can see it's the 4th run of my dev deployment workflow, and we can also see that stuff is already happening down here. And if I click on this, I actually get to see a live view of everything that's going on under the hoods. So pretty exciting in terms of how quickly you're getting the feedback here. And there we go. So this is now switched to a green sign saying that the deployment has succeeded. And in here, I can actually open up my logs, and I can see that there's quite a lot of detail coming through here. So this is very useful in terms of diagnostics and debugging. All those outputs are generated by pbi-tools, right? So this nothing here is GitHub specific. It would be exact same output if we ran this in Bitbucket or Azure DevOps. So what can we see here? Let's have a look at this. First of all, it's saying we're reading settings from a particular file. That's the manifest I mentioned earlier. Secondly, it's saying we're deploying Contoso into development. So this is the data set we're deploying as well as the environment. We're then line 10 retrieving an access token in order to talk to Power BI. We resolved the workspace ID. So datasets dev, which we looked at earlier, has this particular GUID as its ID. Then we're setting certain parameters. I'm going to just skip over that for the time being. And then line 28, it says there's already a data set in place with the exact same name. So we're basically going to update it as opposed to creating a new one. It's just going to give us some outputs here in terms of what's the dataset ID and so on and so forth. And then ultimately, there's also a refresh being triggered, and we can't see that right now because I need to scroll down. So here we go. So if I try again, so here we go. So this is dataset details. Line 49, that's where we're starting. So sorry. Line 49 is where we're starting the refresh, and then everything is done. And the whole process took about 28 seconds, as we can see. As you can imagine, I'm using a pretty simple data set here. It just has a few 10,000 rows or so it doesn't take very long to refresh. So that's the setup. And just going back to Power BI, which would be here. If I now look at this particular data set and go to refresh history, I can see that one refresh just completed. It was triggered using the XMLA endpoint, and it started at 12:22:14 and finished 19. So basically, the refresh itself just took 5 seconds. So that's the setup. Now, what does it look like in terms of the repository? So I'm going to switch to VS Code. So here we go. That's that. And pretty simple, really. We've got a README file. That's always a good idea to have. We've got this JSON file. We'll look into this in a second. That happens to be the deployment manifest. We've got the .github workflows folder. So that one defines what GitHub is supposed to do as part of the deployment. And then most importantly, we've got this folder. I'm just going to expand a few items here, which is Contoso Sales, our data set expanded using pbi-tools. So we can see there are some M queries here, product, promotion, customer, and so on and so forth. And then we've got our tabular tables. If we click into one of those tables, we can see, that's not a good example here, this one is better. If we click inside, we can see the sales table, for instance, has 1, 2, 3, 4 different measures. And it has a whole bunch of columns as well. Here we go. That's every single one of them represented as a separate JSON file. This format, by the way, is quite similar to what Tabular Editor produces as part of the save to folder format. It's not exactly the same, but it's quite similar. So here we go. So that's what we've got. And I mentioned deployment manifest a few times now. So let's look into this now. And in fact, let me move forward a little bit in my slides. So again, I'm going to share those slides with everyone, by the way. So any links which are in here are definitely accessible to you. You don't have to take screenshots or anything like that. So the deployment manifest it defines what's our source. We can specify the source as either a file, in which case it would expect to be a BIM file, so basically the entire model defined in a single JSON structure, or a folder, which is what we're doing here. We need to talk about how we're authenticating with Power BI. only service principals are supported at this point, which is actually the recommended and most secure way of using the API in an automated way. And ultimately, we're also defining environments. So in our case, it would be 3 environments, but there could be any number of those. So let's look at this step by step. I'm going to make this a little bigger, just so you can, hopefully you can see that a little better that way. So we've got a deployment, which I've called Contoso. You could just give that any name that works for you. And then I'm saying the source is in a folder, and the relative path for that folder happens to be Contoso sales. So that's the one we've got over here. Secondly, how am I authenticating? I'm using service principal to authenticate. That happens to be the only type that's currently supported. So for service principals, you always need to specify 3 parameters. What's your tenant? What's the client ID? What's the client secret? Client secret is definitely something you want to keep a secret. So it's not something you would ever want to put directly into this file where it ends up in a repository with other people having access to it. This is something you want to handle securely. And so what I'm doing here, I'm supporting a special syntax which allows for the secret to be injected as an environment variable. So this is standard Windows syntax where you use percentage signs to indicate that this is coming from an environment variable. And if we're then moving down to our environments, I mentioned development, UAT, production before. So each environment has one required setting, which is what's the workspace. Everything else is optional. So we can see the dev workspace is used here, the prod workspace is used here and there. Display name determines what the dataset will be called within Power BI. And that allows us to actually reuse the same workspace for 2 different environments, right? So what's happening here is that the UAT version of the dataset gets a suffix UAT, whereas the production version doesn't. And so that's how we can basically keep them in parallel without any conflicts. And ultimately, there's also a refresh feature in place, which we've seen already. If that's set to true for any of the environments, a dataset refresh will be triggered automatically. So that's that. And then finally, the GitHub workflow files. As you can see, I've defined an individual workflow for each different environment. The reason for that is that they all have different triggers. Everything else is the same. So let's look at this. So trigger is basically in the case of GitHub. Again, each system has slightly different syntax here, but in the case of GitHub, triggers are defined using the on parameter. So I've got a pull request trigger as well as a workflow dispatch trigger. Workflow dispatch sounds a little weird. What that means is you can go into GitHub and actually trigger the workflow manually. What I did earlier, that's basically what is possible because workflow dispatch is showing up here. So for pull request, there's a branch filter, and for the manual trigger, we can define some inputs. So remember, there was a what if checkbox, which I was able to check or uncheck. That's basically where that's coming from. So that's that. And scrolling down, the whole thing is relatively straightforward once you get the hang of it. I appreciate there's a lot of stuff in here that you might see for the very first time. So I'll walk you through it. So first of all, let's define the CI/CD environment within which the deployment will be run. This is what's happening in lines 23, 24, 25, 26. We're running on Ubuntu, on Linux, and we're actually using a container. The huge advantage of using a container is that everything you need in terms of dependencies is pre-installed for you. You literally just specify what it says on line 26, use the pbi-tools core container, and that's it. You don't need to worry about installing anything else. Using Linux and Ubuntu, first of all, is a feature. pbi-tools runs on either Windows or Linux. Using Linux has the huge advantage that it's a lot cheaper, right? And usually faster as well. So in GitHub, for instance, if you run anything within a Windows environment, you get a ×2 factor applied to your pricing. So everything basically costs twice as much as opposed to the equivalent Linux environment. So that's one of the reasons why pbi-tools supports Linux. So if we then go down here, we've got a few steps defined. In fact, conveniently, they all fit on one screen. Now, what's actually needed in terms of the deployment to be triggered is only this one. Well, actually, also that one. So the checkout step basically makes sure that the sources are available to the workflow. And then down here, we're running pbi-tools deploy. And the two steps in between are basically just for diagnostics. They're optional, and they just allow us to basically see additional outputs just in case something goes wrong. I would strongly recommend keeping that in there, but technically it's not needed. Technically, it's only necessary to have the checkout step and then the pbi-tools deploy step in here. So what is happening down here? Basically, this one is the pbi-tools core executable that's provided from the container. You don't have to worry about it. Secondly, we're saying we want to use the deploy command. So that's an action. Thirdly, this little dot is actually quite meaningful because that's a folder reference. So dot by convention refers to the current folder. And so that basically means any relative paths within our manifest will always be resolved to the root of the repository. And then here, this one references a deployment profile. Remember when we looked at the JSON file earlier, it said Contoso. That's pretty much what's being referenced here. We can also see that the environment doesn't feature here, right? Remember, we had development, UAT, and production specified. Development always happens to be the default. So if you don't specify an environment, it goes for an environment that's called development. If we go into UAT, for instance, we can see there is an additional parameter down here, which literally not having a good time with my shortcuts today, which literally says UAT. So there we go. And that's pretty much the whole magic in terms of how those files interact with each other. So let me show you, by the way, what is, how much time do I have? Are we going till 12:50 roughly?
Yep, 12:50 sounds good.
Okay, yeah, awesome. So let me show you one other feature which is incredibly useful, particularly as you're setting up your pipelines and as you're trying things out, because one of the design goals for pbi-tools deployments was to be able to actually run the entire process locally as well as in the cloud, right? So we've seen those pipelines run in GitHub before, but I can very easily do the exact same thing on my own machine in order to actually see precisely what will end up happening in GitHub or Azure DevOps, for instance, which I think is well, not just useful, but actually quite necessary, particularly when you're setting up those pipelines. So I'm currently in the folder containing my repository. I can actually go in here and type pbi-tools deploy. Remember, the first parameter is always the folder reference, so I'm going with dot here. Then contoso was the manifest name. Just going to bring this up again as a reminder. So this is contoso. That's the one I'm talking about. And again, if I don't specify an environment, it defaults to develop. I happen to be on the release branch right now. You can see that down here, right? So that one corresponds to the UAT environment, so I'm going to go for that. And what I can do now is I can say what if, and that one will basically do a test run of my deployment without actually deploying anything. So this is your safeguard, right? So I literally always start off doing a what if run in order to ensure that I haven't missed anything. You definitely don't want to mess anything up in your environment, even if it's not production. So, and basically what we can see here is exactly the same output which we saw in GitHub earlier, only here we can directly engage with it. So what does what if do? What if, as I said, doesn't actually deploy anything, but it does everything else. Most importantly, what if validates your credentials? So it does use the authentication settings I've defined, and it does aim to acquire an access token. And the what if deployment run will fail if there's anything wrong here, right? So this is a very good test. Secondly, it looks it tries to resolve the workspace. It may well be the case that the service principal you're using here doesn't have access to the workspace, right? So in that case, it would fail at this point, and it wouldn't be able to proceed any further. Thirdly, there's a concept of parameters, which we're probably not going to be able to cover in much detail today. So they're all resolved here. So you can actually see what those parameters will look like. Or would look like if you were to go and deploy this for real. And everything else is pretty much just showing, well, what are, do we already have a remote data set or do we not, right? So if I now clear my screen and run the same thing without the what if parameter, like so, then it is going out and it actually deploys it for real. Exactly. Something's going wrong here, but this is expected. I wanted to show that. It deploys it for real, and I get the exact same outputs here. So what's going on here? Why is this currently failing? Let me just show you what this looks like here. So basically, I was trying to deploy the UAT version of the dataset. Now, if I go to the dataset settings, I can see that it's never been refreshed. and it's currently owned by my service principal rather than anyone else. There's one limitation right now, which is quite important to be aware of. Credentials always need to be set explicitly when a dataset is created for the first time. And that means in this case, that UAT version of the dataset was deployed, in fact, just earlier today by myself, but I never set credentials for it, which is why it now fails when a refresh is attempted here. So what I need to do currently, I need to go in, take over the data set in order to then have my credentials applied. Credentials in Power BI are always maintained in the user profile. So basically, this user, the Mathias at pbi-tools.org, which is what I'm logged in as, that one already has credentials predefined for those data sources. So now I'm good. Now I can actually refresh the data set, which means if I go back here and basically just rerun this exact same process, so again, not using what if, it will, well, hopefully succeed this time, because the refresh, which is part of the deployment, can actually, there we go. And now we're good, right? So this is something really important, which I wanted to point out. At this point, setting credentials is a manual step. However, remember I said this is a preview version right now. In the next release for this, credential setting will actually be introduced as part of what pbi-tools does for you. This area is very poorly documented by Microsoft, and it appears as if that's not something you can actually automate, but I figured out that it is possible to automate that and actually set credentials as part of your pipeline. So this is basically coming in the next release. But for now, this is what we've got. Let me just go through my slides, because I want to be able to take some questions as well. So we looked into this. We looked into the workflow file. Yeah, so this is just sort of an outlook into something that's coming. I've basically assumed a particular branching model as part of this setup and as part of this demo, where, again, the main branch represents production, which that's pretty standard, but where release branches are used for integration purposes, for basically integrating changes into upcoming releases, and where issue branches are used to develop specific changes and bug fixes. That's a model which I'm going to do further talks on in the very near future, and this particular diagram is should serve as a starting point for now. So let me leave it here, just in interest of time, and open the floor to questions if there are any.
Yeah, so thank you, Matthias. So if anyone has any questions, you can drop them in the chat, or you're free to unmute and ask.
Matthias, I have one. This is Google. How does all of this stand alongside Power BI Premium deployment pipelines? What are the differences between the two?
Yeah, very good question. Because So first of all, because I'm relying on the XML endpoint here, this process is premium only, just like Power BI pipelines are, right? So that's not the difference. But the key difference really is that we've got source control at the core of this process, right? We have a Git view of what's in my model, what's in my reports, and we are able to actually use a Git-based process to trigger deployments, which is not the case with Power BI deployment pipelines, right? Power BI deployment pipelines assume that somebody pushes items from Power BI desktop straight into a Power BI workspace, and then everything else happens there, which is great, you know, as a simple setup, but you have no visibility in terms of change management. You have no visibility what's different between two versions. Power BI deployment pipelines only tell you whether or not there's a difference, but it will never tell you what there is, and that's the big change. That's the big difference here. I wasn't personally satisfied, you know, with that limitation.
Okay. And the other point is that even this one, you need to have Power BI Premium because you're using XML endpoints.
Correct. Unfortunately, I wish that weren't the case, but we're talking about automation here, and as far as data sets are concerned, the only automation capability we have is XMLA, which unfortunately is premium only. When it comes to reports and deploying reports out of source control, the story is different. That is supported for Pro as well, and I've done various talks about that previously, so please do go ahead and check that one out. With datasets, however, unfortunately, it's slightly different.
Understood. Thanks, Matthias.
Okay. Yes, so the slides will be shared, absolutely. I always do that. And hopefully the recording will also be available on YouTube or so, right? Yeah. And as you've seen, the GitHub repository is already in place and is already publicly available. But I was just answering a question in the chat, by the way, in case that wasn't obvious.
Do we have any more questions? If not, Matthias, thank you very much for your session. I'm sure many of us would find it very useful. I think it does fill a certain gap when it comes to Power BI deployments. So we do hope that our attendees find it useful. So thank you very much once again for taking time off your busy schedule to speak to us and to present this to us. Thank you.
My pleasure. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
Next, we have a community session from Afifa Zuhair, who is a product manager at IFS. So Afifa will be speaking to us about financial statements in Power BI. So Afifa, the screen is all yours.
Thank you. So I'm going to start off by sharing my screen.
Yeah, we can see your screen.
Okay, excellent. Right. Okay, so a very good evening to everyone on the call. And today I'm going to help you get started on your journey with creating financial statements in Power BI. So a quick intro about me. My name is Afifa Zuhair. I work as a product manager at IFS. IFS does a lot of work with the Microsoft data stack. So even our flagship product contains a whole bunch of pre-packaged analytical content, which is built on the tabular models, but we're always looking at using the latest tech from Microsoft. So we're looking at Power BI datasets and data flows and data marts, which was the latest functionality that was unveiled at the Build conference 2 weeks ago. So in a nutshell, there's plenty of things to keep us busy in the analytics space. But today, I want to share with you some tips and tricks that you can use when you want to create financial statements in Power BI. And I want this to be a 90% demo, 10% presentation kind of session. So I'm going to do the demo and focus on the income statements, but rest be assured that the technique I use here for the income statement can be applied for balance sheets and cash flow statements as well. Right? So if you look at the agenda, first we're going to focus on the demo, and this is going to be the major part of the session, where I'm just going to start from a blank page and show you how you create that income statement from scratch. And then we will have a little bit of the remaining time to just look at how you can use standard Power BI capabilities to augment that traditional income statement that we created. And we'll also have a sneak peek at some of the third-party visuals, the custom visuals that you can use to create an income statement if you need. So with that, I just want to share this quote. This is something I came across a couple of weeks ago, and I think it's really appropriate for today. So it says here that the current day's income statements are influenced by the capabilities of Excel. And the reason I want to call this out is that whenever you start talking about using Power BI to create financial statements, there's always going to be a person in the room who's grown up creating these kind of statements in Excel and believes they should always be done in Excel. But the reverse is true, right? Today's format of financial statements was actually driven from the capabilities that were there in Excel and other spreadsheet software, which means that the format of tomorrow's financial statements could very well be driven from the best of breed tools we have today. And that's a good thing to keep in mind when working in Power BI. All right, but since most people recognize an income statement when it looks like this, I'm going to start off with creating this kind of a formatted income statement. So you have your standard subtotals for revenue and cost of goods sold, and you calculate your cost profit and your net profit at the end. You also sometimes want to see these values against your previous years and maybe against your budgeted years, your budgeted values for the future. So if we go in and start by looking at our source data, so I'm going to just go into this. And here we have our sales orders. I hope you can see an Excel file now. So the sales order shows you your revenue information. And as you see here, the sales orders are against a particular order date. And it's also grouped by 3 different channels, right? So we have wholesale, distributor, and export. If we take a look at our company expenses, these are rolled up to an expense category, and you see here that you have your cost of goods sold expenses, and then you have all the other expenses. But notice here that the expenses are against the first day of the month or against the month. So this gives us some a reminder that one of the transformations that we need to do is we need to get our revenue and our expenses against the same granularity so we can compare them. And then we have some additional dimensions. These are not needed to create that traditional income statement, but later on, if you want to use standard Power BI for slicing and creating some additional visuals, then these dimensions will be useful. So we have a simple customer dimension, a products dimension, and some information about regions. And then finally, probably the most important one. So when creating an income statement, the layout or the template of the income statement will vary from company to company. So you need to come in here and define the template of your income statement. In our case, we have decided that we want to see our revenues against the 3 different channels, and we want to see our cost of goods sold like this, and then we have all the other expenses with these particular label names, right? And then we have the net profit and so on. And the row index column here is used as a sorting column. So we use this to sort the order in which the items will appear in our income statement. And similarly, we have a summary index column, which is used to sort the order of the subtotals you see here. So now let's go ahead and import this data into Power BI. And like I said, we're going to start from a blank slate so that there are no hidden complexities. So if you select Excel and select the file that I just showed you, we are interested in our sales order, regions, products, the template, the customers, and our expenses. All right, so if you go ahead and then transform the data, so if we first start with our sales orders table, we can do a quick rename to sales. And if you just scroll to the left, we see that we have our line total column. So that's the order quantity into unit price. So we have that calculated for us. We also see that we have two empty or columns or null columns here, and we want to remove that because that might affect performance. If you don't need the date columns, then make sure you remove them. And then if you move into the company expenses table, again, let's do a quick rename here. And then you see here that the first row is not promoted as a header. So let's use this option to promote the first row as the header. And the thing about Power BI is that it really likes long, thin tables that makes sure that you have optimum performance in your report. So we want to unpivot this data like so. So we're going to say unpivot other columns. So we get all those values in an attribute value format like this. So we can now rename this to date. And since this is a date, let's make sure it's in the right format. And this can be a fixed decimal number. Right, so that's just a few transformations that we need to do. And given that we're going to slice this information by the time, we're going to need to include a time dimension. So there are so many different ways of doing this. My preference is to do it in Power Query itself. So I have this Power Query definition of a function, and I'm going to go into the advanced editor here, and I'm just going to paste this code. And what this will do is that it will give me these parameters that I can enter. And I know that my data starts from 2015. So I will enter the start date as 2015, 1st of January, and it goes up until 2018. This is the start and end date of your data set. So let's say 31st of December. And the financial start month is January. So I'm going to say 1. So when I invoke this, it will generate this date table, and I can rename this as dates. And now I think we have all the data we need. If we need to add something more, we can always come back. So let's close and apply these changes. And once these are loaded, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to quickly look at the tables and the relationships and make sure that our data model is in order. All right, so if we go into the data model now, I did not remove the option that allows Power BI to automatically detect relationships. So you're going to see here that you have some relationships that are not very meaningful. Example of why you should not use that option, the automatic detection of relationships, but instead connect them manually yourself. So here we have the sales table, which is going to act as our fact, and we want to connect it to the customer and the product dimension. So let me quickly connect that, as well as the region, and as well as our date dimension. Now, if you had different dates here, like order date and due date, then you would have to figure out which one is your active and inactive relationship. But in our case, it's a very simple model. Now, I'm not going to connect these two tables. For the template table, this is really used for a layout purpose, so it doesn't make sense to connect it to the model. When it comes to the expenses table, like I said in the beginning, the expenses are rolled up against the month and the revenues are rolled up against the date. So what I'm going to do is create a new table that combines our expenses and revenues against a month, the same granularity, and then I'm going to connect that table into the model. So let's go ahead and just have a look at what we need to do. Here, if I first look at the expense table, here you see that you have a total expense value that is calculated against the first day of the month for a given expense item. So we need to have a similar measure for our revenue items as well. So I'm now going to go ahead and create our first measure. I'm going to create a new table to store our measures so we can just find it easier. So I'm going to copy paste the DAX code here because I don't want you to sit and wait and watch me type, but I'll walk through exactly what happens with each measure that we create. So let's go ahead and create a measure for the total sales, which is very basic, just summing up the line total column that you saw in the sales table, right? Now, once we have that measure, we can go ahead and create a new table that shows or calculates our total sales per month per revenue item. So let's go ahead and create a new measure now, not a measure, sorry, but a new table. Let's go in here and create a new table, and let's call it channel revenue because we are interested in seeing our revenue grouped against channels, the different channels. And what we do here is we use the summarize function. So we're going to look at the sales table, and then we're going to group the values by the sales channel. So remember the three channels, distributor, export, and wholesale. Then we're going to group it by the month, and we're going to assign a hard-coded value category called revenue for the category. And we will calculate the first date of the month using the main function. And then we will use our total sales measure to calculate the total sales for this particular grouping, right? So if I go ahead and hit enter now, you should see that we get the data in a similar format that it is in the expense table. So once you have this, you can go ahead and combine these two tables because they are now in a similar format. So I'm going to create another table, and let's call it the income statement table. And this is going to be the table that we use later on throughout the session. So we're basically combining the expense table and the channel revenue table that we just created, and we're making sure that we select the columns in the order that matches the columns in the expense table, right? So we're using the same summarize function here. So if I go ahead and hit enter now, what you would expect is, as you can see here, you now have all your expenses as well as your revenue items over here in the same table. So this is the format we need in order to create that income statement layout. I mean, there are different techniques, but in this particular technique, I need my revenue and expense table to be from one table. It makes everything much easier. So just for clarity, I'm going to rename this category as expense category to category. And similarly for the expense items, let's rename this to items because it contains everything in one table now. Right, and let's make sure that the date is a short date. So, and we can change the value to a currency format and limit it to 2 decimal points. All right. So once we've done this, you saw in the income statement layout that we have categories such as revenue and expenses, and we're going to need to identify and differentiate between these two types of details, whether it's a revenue or whether it's an expense. So to make that job easier, I'm going to add a new column here that basically looks at the category column. So it just looks at this category column, and if it's a revenue, then we say the type is of revenue. Otherwise, it's going to be an expense type. And this is going to be, this additional roll-up is going to be used for later on. So once we have this, we can go ahead now into our data model and connect this. So we can connect this to our dates table. And as you see here, we only have a whole bunch of one-to-many relationships. We stay away from any many-to-many relationships, right? Yes, so I think now that we have the data model complete, we can go ahead and start looking at what our report is going to look like from a formatting perspective. So remember that this is the table. The template table is the one that we use when it comes to layout and formatting. So let me just go ahead and add a table to our report, right? And I'm going to need the row index because this is how we sort the items. And I'm going to say, don't summarize, so that it just lists everything in ascending order. And then I'm going to add the income statement items here, right? And then here, there is an option to say show items with no data because we want to list everything here. Then we want to hide this. So we have to do a bit of formatting here. So we want to hide this row index column. We don't want it to be visible to the user. But the moment you do that, you get this horrible text wrap. So let's go into the row column headers, I think it was. Yes, and then we remove the text wrap. Similarly, we want to remove the text wrap on the values as well. So we remove it here. And once you do that, you just get this nicely formatted, nicely indented layout of your income statement items, right? So now that we have this, the next thing that we need to do is we need to now create the measure that we're going to, that's going to show us the values against each of these categories. So if we go back into our tables and have a look at our income statement data, so you see here that we have this value, and obviously we can't do anything without summing on this value. So the first measure is going to be quite straightforward. We're just going to create a sum of the value in that table. So I'm going to go into my measure table and let's add this measure called financial values. And we are basically summing up the value column in our statement data table. Now, if I then drag this measure onto the report, let me just create a table and drag the financial values here, and let's drag the type. So whether it's a revenue or an expense. So you see here that the total revenue and expense is calculated correctly. But if you look at this total over here, 290, this is wrong because what we want is the revenue, the expenses to be subtracted. So we need to include some additional logic in our measure so that if it's an expense, then we want to multiply it by -1, right? So let's go ahead and now create that additional measure with that additional logic. And we can call it actuals. Right. So what we're doing here is we're going to use our previously created measure, financial values, but except we're going to add a filter context where we only look at to calculate this measure for revenue type, and we assign it to a variable. We do the same for expenses, but like you see here, we multiply it by -1. And then we see that if the selected value is a revenue, we choose the revenue variable, and if it's an expense, we choose this expense variable which has the income, which has the minus value incorporated. And if it's not any of these, then so for example, in your summary totals, for example, you would then add your revenue and expense together. And given that we want to display all the values in our income statement in thousands, we use the divide operation to divide this final value by 1,000, right? So if I go ahead now and drag this on to my table. Just sort this like that. So if we drag the actuals now, you see here that we get the minus value and our total is calculated correctly, right? So now what happens if we just drag this actuals against our income statement? So you see here that you have this total value that is displayed here. It's not getting any context from here. And the reason for that is the income statement items is coming from the income statement template table. And if you go into our model, you see here that this table is not connected to our model. So there is no filter context or slicing that can happen. The table that is connected is the income statement data table. And if you look at both these tables, they both contain all the items that we have in our income statement. So you have this column over here that contains all the items, and it's the very same column that is displayed in the template table as well. So I'm going to show you what we're going to do in the measure just by adding a slicer. So let's create a slicer for the items in our income statement data table. Right. And now, so just look, if you look at these values here, if I select cost of goods sold for equipment, you see here that we get the correct value of 484, and that also is passed here. Of course, it's passed for everything, but it does get it from here. So we can use this technique and apply it in a measure. So what we're going to do is that whenever we go through the items in this table, we're going to apply the selected value and apply that filter into this table and then calculate the measure. So if we then look at how we do that in a DAX function, let's go ahead and go into our measures table. And now we're going to call it a selected year actual because we're using the selected value. So what we're doing here is that when you use a selected value, if it returns one value, in our case, it's always going to return one value, given that we have one value in this column. If we'll just return the selected value and then we store that in a variable, and then we're going to calculate the actual measure, but we're going to add a filter context here where the current item is equal to the item in this particular table here, right? So if I go ahead and create this measure now, and let's remove the actuals here, and now let's drag in the selected year actuals. And if you remove this filter over here, you see that we get the correct total, right? So what's happening here is that we're looking at the selected value, and in this case, it's distributor. And then we apply a filter on this table for all items that is of distributor that rolls up to distributor, and then we get the total here and display it here, right? So we're almost a good 90% done with getting the values in our income statement. The only thing remaining is the subtotals, and that's probably the easiest part. So let me just go ahead and delete these tables. So the subtotals are just a bunch of mathematical functions, so I'm going to go through them quite quickly. Let's first start off with the total revenue measure. To do that, we're just going to use our original financial value measure, except we're going to apply a filter context for type equals revenue, right? We're going to do the similar thing for cost of goods sold. Again, we add the filter context for cost of goods sold. Here we use the category column and we multiply it by -1 because it's an expense. And then if you have your revenues and your cost of goods sold, creating your gross profit isn't rocket science, right? So we then just go ahead and calculate our gross profit like this, revenue minus cost of goods sold. And then we can go ahead and create our gross profit margin. So these are all pretty straightforward measures. So we're just calling the divide function and dividing our gross profit by revenue. And then for the other expenses, so we have a total that denotes all the other expenses, and you can do this in different ways. The way I've done it is I'm just going to calculate a total of all expenses, right? And then I'm going to reduce or minus my cost of goods sold. It's plus here because this value actually comes on with a minus. And then I'm going to again multiply it by -1 because it's an expense and it needs to be reflected as a negative figure. So once you have that, you just have two more measures to create for your net profit and your net profit margin. So let's go ahead and create those two as well. So net profit is going to be revenue minus cost of goods sold minus other expenses. And then finally, we can create your net profit margin. dividing your net profit by revenue. So once we have the measures created for all of those subtotals, but now we need to figure out how we get that reflected in this particular measure. So the technique we're going to use here is that when we iterate through these rows, if the particular total or the item is total revenue, then we're going to show the value of the revenue measure. If the selected item is total cost of goods sold, we're going to show this particular measure. So we're going to do a similar thing for all the subtotals. So it sounds like we need to have some conditional logic added into this selected year actuals measure, right? So let me go ahead and update this measure with that additional conditional logic. So what we do here is we still get the selected value, and instead now we use a switch statement because we have multiple conditions to run through. And like I said, if it's a total revenue and we're really, so this needs to be a one-to-one match with your the labels that you have in your income statement. Based on this, you would choose the relevant measure to include, and we just pass it through the divide function because we want to show everything in thousands. So the only thing I would call out here is the gross profit margin and the net profit margin. So notice here how we use the format function. So this is quite a neat trick to apply when you want the formatting of one row in your table to differ from the formatting of other rows. So in our case, these two need to be shown as percentage values. So that's why we use the format function here. And for the rest, it's pretty simple. We just check the current item and then substitute it with the relevant measure. And the default option of the switch statement would be to filter out our income statement data. So this is the operation we did initially, right? So we just added a whole bunch of additional conditions for the subtotals. So now if I go ahead and save that, you see here that now we get our subtotals calculated correctly. And you see here that the gross profit is calculated, showing a gross, the percentage format as well. And if you scroll down, you have your total net profit as well as your net profit margin. So that's very quickly how you would go from those 5 or 6 disconnected Excel tables in Excel to this format of an income statement. And I think it matches quite closely with the income statements that we saw in the slides. So what I'm going to do next is I'm just going to copy this and paste this over again. And I'm going to change this into a matrix format and just show you some other simple formatting that you can do to change it around. So let's drag the income statement items into the rows now, given that it's a matrix. And let's go right down to the lowest level of data. Let's drill down. So what I want to do is I want to get rid of this row index again. So there is an option in here. If you go into row headers, where you can disable the stepped layout option. This would separate this two, so we can hide this, and we can also get rid of our row subtotals. And we also want to turn off the row, the word wrap, just like we did in the table. So if I search for this, it should be text wrap here. So you see that you get similar format in a matrix. Now, the cool thing about Power BI and the concept of the data model is that once you have this, you can just go ahead and drag in your year into your columns over here, into your columns of your matrix. And now you very quickly can have your income statement reflected by year as well, right? So that's just how simple it is to build on something once you have the basic building blocks in place. So that was the first topic of the agenda, right? The demo, end-to-end demo of the income statement. The second one was really how we augment this with standard out-of-the-box Power BI functionality. And I'm going to show you that by just navigating to an already completed report. So he would recognize the income statement that we just created, right? The difference is here that there is additional formatting that has been applied. We have had some data bars and formatting per column, etc. Right? Now, once you have this in place, you can go in and create some time intelligence measures, right? So you can very easily create some measures to reflect the total sales and gross profit margin of last year, and then do a last year versus this year comparison. So at a glance, now we can see that in March, we have done considerably worse than last year, but in October, we've done considerably better than last year, right? So this is some of the quick analysis that you can do, and it really supplements the income statement that you provide here, because you can't get this quick insight from this tabular format. And that kind of goes back to that quote that just because we created income statements like this all our lives, it doesn't mean that this is the only format of presenting this data. So if you can take it one step further, and given that we had those customer and product dimensions, you can also analyze your profit margins by your customers, by your products, and by your regions. And using the rank functions, you can also calculate your top 5 customers or your top 5 cities. And then you can go ahead and analyze, okay, so my top customer contributes 60% to my profit margin, and that 60% comes from these particular products in these particular regions, right? So the kind of analysis that you can do just by creating a few additional measures is enormous, and the value you can generate from that analysis is quite important to keep in mind. Yes, and with that, I think I come to the last topic on the agenda. So let me just go back to my slides. And this is about third-party custom visuals, right? So we looked at creating the income statement using the standard Power BI visual, and then we looked at some of the out-of-the-box functionality in Power BI. But if you have some really sticky requirements around formatting, and you really want fine-grained control over the formatting, then there are a whole bunch of custom visuals that you can use. So I just selected 3 custom visuals randomly. So this is from Zebra BI, and you see here that it gives you the drill down capabilities, or the capability to expand and collapse your categories. You have different formatting, and then you have this visual over here that lets you see your underperforming areas at a glance. And it also generates this text here, which is automatically generated using the underlying machine learning model in Power BI to kind of give you a heads up into where you want to look into. Then you have this one, I think is, yes, this is from InfoRiver. And this is like if you really want a pixel perfect report, PDF report generated. So where you want to export your report and you want it to keep the formatting in place, then this is a good example of the kind of visual you could use. And then again, you have this one from ProfitBase. Again, you have the ability to drill down and conditional formatting all the way down to each individual cell and subtotal, right? So these are just 3 random custom visuals that I picked. You probably need to understand your requirements and select which one is the most suitable. So let me just quickly open a file which has the profit-based custom visual, so I can show you that and how that looks like. Yeah, so while that opens, if you're wondering why you need to use a custom visual, I can show you a quick example of one of the limitations in this standard visual, right? So if I wanted to change the formatting of these subtotals, I could go ahead and go into the values and say conditional formatting. And let's say we want to change the background color. Right, so now what I'm going to do is, remember that we had the summary index in our layout table or in the template table. So based on that summary index, we can decide whether we want to apply some formatting or not. So if it's not a summary, if it's not a subtotal, then there's no formatting. If it is a subtotal, then I want to apply that formatting. And once you do that, you have this formatting applied. But what if I wanted to, instead of applying a background color, if I wanted to make this bold, then that's something that is not currently supported in the matrix? Or what if I wanted to extend this blue color, the same color over into the row headers? That is also not easily possible. Maybe you can do it with a bunch of complicated DAX measures, but it's not available out of the box, right? So that's the kind of fine-grained formatting that you can do very easily with some of the custom visuals. So in here, I have the profit-based custom visual. So I've imported this visual beforehand. And if you take a look at this, right, you see here that you have this additional expand collapse capability. You have total control of where you want the totals to be, subtotals to be displayed. So whether you want it to appear on the top or at the bottom, and you have total control over, formatting like bold, and for each level, for each row, for each cell, you have total control of how you want this to be formatted, right? And for a business user, if you want them to be able to interact with this and, for example, be able to sum two values, you can go into edit mode. So a business user wouldn't want to be writing any sort of DAX code. So let's say we just want to add a new total here that sums the sales and the operational income, right? I'm just going to go ahead here and say add row before, and then it gives me this title. So I'm just going to say test total, right, which appears here. And then you can, just by simply clicking, create the formula for your row, for your subtotal, right? So you see the test total is this value, and which is exactly the same as the total operating income. And you can go ahead and change the style. So I can just make it a bold style, or I can choose a custom style. Let's say custom 2, right? And if you're wondering how those are driven, so this custom visual has been built with these. So all these custom styles are available here. So we've selected custom 2, and I can go ahead here and say that the font, let's select something else. Let's say custom 1. Yeah, so that's red. And if I change the color over here, then that gets applied very easily. So if you really need your business user to be able to interact and create some subtotals and do some formatting as well, then these kind of visuals will give you more control over it. All right, and then if we go back to our slides, yeah, so kind of if you're wondering how you learn this, the content that I created for this presentation, I used Enterprise DNA. So that's a Power BI enablement organization, and I can quickly show you, go through their website. The thing about Enterprise DNA is if you are not a technical user, but more a business user who is trying to understand the art of the possible in Power BI, then I would highly recommend this platform. You have a bunch of Power BI showcases. So I've opened one of their showcases. You can straight away download this report, connect it to your data, and start tweaking it and use it. So it gets you off to a quick start if you're not too interested in learning all the technical details. If you're interested in, being certified, then obviously the Microsoft Learn website is your best source of learning. And if you are a developer, interested in understanding more about Power BI and the related technologies, then I would recommend SQL BI, which is the ultimate resource for hardcore techies, and you understand, performance constraints and how certain DAX functions are better than others and things like that. So it really goes into the detail. So these are some of the resources I would recommend. And yeah, if you just go into the conclusion, so we started off by looking at the income statement as a standard visual in Power BI, right? And then we looked at, augmenting that with some other standard Power BI visuals and also the custom visuals. And if you need to figure out which one of those approaches you use, it all begins with your requirements. Do you have really complicated requirements around formatting? What does the data model look like? Do you need to export that functionality to PDF? How strict are those export requirements? Those are some of the questions you need to ask before you decide which approach you can use. And the approach that I use for the income statement, where you have a template table and you just try to create the measures that calculates the values against that template. You can use that similar technique for your balance sheet and cash flow. The only difference would be that it's the differences in the template table, right? How the layout would look. And as always, don't forget to look how you can use, out of the box Power BI capabilities to supplement what you show in that tabular format, right? There's a lot of cool visuals out there. The Q&A visual is a good one as well that you can always use to just give more analysis capabilities to your user and not just give a very fixed, rigid income statement or financial statement. And with that, I come to the last slide. So if you have any questions, now is a good time to ask. I'll try my best to answer them. And if you don't have questions, I would really love your feedback on this session. So I would just like to paste this link into the chat. If you have any feedback, then I'm more than happy to hear them. Yeah.
So if anyone has any questions, please drop them in the chat or unmute and ask.
Hi, Afifa.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a great presentation. I just have one question.
Yeah.
When we are using financial statements to present the data, so is there any free custom visual that you have been using before just to bring the insights more clearly as a free custom visual? I see that most of the custom visuals like Zebra, BI Analytics, they provide with a little bit expensive subscription. So I'm just thinking free editions, what are the available ones, if you can?
I don't have experience with a completely free visual. I do know that all three of the visuals that I showed have a free version with limited capability. So you would have to see if that is sufficient. But I'm not aware of a free visual that has all the capabilities that you would need ideally in the free version. Most of them have the free as well as the premium version or the paid version.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it looks like we don't have any more questions. So thank you, Afifa, for that very useful and insightful session. I'm sure a lot of our attendees would find that very innovative, maybe drifting away from the traditional Excel approach. So thank you very much, and thank you very much for your time this evening. And it's always a pleasure to have people from our own community showcasing their skills and spreading their knowledge. So thank you, Afifa, and also thank you to Matthias for sticking around. So with that, we conclude this session. So if you do have any questions, you're welcome to join our user community site. Please sign up. And this session would be available on our YouTube channel shortly. So see you again next time. And thank you for joining. Please take care. And good evening. Good night. Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining, everyone.